practical approaches to musical inclusivity. We're absolutely delighted to have Cian Lester here today as our presenter. So Cian Lester has just become Dr. Cian Lester and gained their PhD from the University of Huddersfield. Some of you may know their work through their book Trans Like Me, an absolutely incredible book if you've not read it. And they're also a classical mezzo-soprano, a writer and activist. And we're absolutely delighted that they're here delivering our session today. So I'm going to hand you over now to them. Fantastic, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody. Before we even begin, I wanted to say that if you have questions, we are going to have a Q&A section at the end, but please feel free to put those questions in the chat as we go along, particularly if you feel that you feel quite shy about saying something. And when I say a room full of singers, maybe people won't be shy, but also it's a Saturday morning and none of us have any social skills anymore after being so long in lockdown. Thank you very much for that introduction, Elizabeth. I wanted just to give you a little bit more of a background, particularly sort of why I care so much about working with trans singers. So I am a trans singer, so that would be it. I started singing, I'm sure like many of you, quite young, singing in youth choirs, sort of graduating into working with chamber choirs, doing the sort of rounds of choral competitions and choral tours. I then went on to study music at university, worked as a choral scholar. Once I was training as a concert pianist, had a very bad accident and switched to training as an opera singer and as a classical singer as well. So I work as a classical singer. I also work as an alternative singer, but I've also been working as a singing teacher for a long time, particularly working with trans students, not by any particular it just sort of worked out that way. The more I was working as an out trans singer, the more trans singers would come to me. So it's something which I'm really, really passionate about, and also something which I've found there's very little information available on. So the study of trans singers, and really including trans musicians as serious musicians, is pretty slow going. It's pretty in its infancy. There's a little bit of data we have in terms of academic data and scientific data, but not much. So a lot of this is going to be anecdotal. And actually, I have found that some of the things which I have learned from my own practice and working with my students and working with my trans colleagues, I run a trans arts night at the Barbican, and that means I get to work with trans singers and musicians from around the world, which is very lucky for me. A lot of what we have experienced goes against the sort of received wisdom. So when I was a teenager and I was realizing that I was trans and coming out, and this is 20 years ago, and the information which I found was that if you went on hormone treatment, if you went on testosterone therapy, if you were assigned female at birth, was that you would lose your voice entirely. So that really, frightened the hell out of me. So I chose not to go on testosterone treatment. It's very interesting now, we're really learning that that's not the case. So that's just one instance where the received wisdom just really doesn't seem to match up with the lived reality of trans singers. So that's something I'll be coming back to later on in the session. But as we start off, what I'd like to talk about just before we get going into the meat of the session itself is to think about who we are in this space together, what our goals are, and what the breakdown of the session will be. It's important to note there is a huge range of experience. Thank you very much to everybody who filled in the questionnaire. From that, I can see that really, as a group, we have people who have never worked with trans singers before, who maybe don't know any trans singers or don't know any trans people, but who want to learn. And also people who are themselves trans or have great experience with working with trans colleagues and trans friends. So what I want to do is to bear that in mind. I'm not going to be pitching this information to everybody. Some of this you may know, some of it you might not. But I would love to hear what your experiences are if you feel comfortable sharing them. So the Q&A section at the end, I'd love to think of not just as please ask me questions, but please share your experiences. And if there are people within this webinar who have useful things to say, please feel free to answer as well. I want this to be collaborative. I realize it's easy to say I'd like this to be collaborative when I'm a disembodied face on a Zoom, rather than the fact that, you know, in previous times we'll be sitting around all eating biscuits and drinking tea. But please eat some biscuits and drink some tea. Thank you, I'm seeing some tea, fabulous. If that makes it feel more comfortable, and let's try and bring that sort of sense. However, this is a good thing. The range of experiences was huge, but people's desired outcomes for this session were all incredibly similar, which gives me faith that we can get there by the end of sort of 12:30. And I sort of boiled them down into 3 specific goals that we could bear in mind. And those goals were to gain a broad knowledge of who trans singers are and how to support trans singers. And those trans singers are students, colleagues, and singers in our choirs. How to make them feel safe and supported, how to make them know that they are valued, but critically not to make them feel singled out, because nobody likes to be a pity case or a charity case. Nobody likes to feel sort of patted on the head and going, well done, you're valued. It's much more sort of holistic and organic than that. Developing on from that, people said that they wanted to find out how best to support trans voices and trans music making. So taking that information about the general into the specific. And of course, bearing in mind, there is no such thing as one single trans voice, but there are some interesting experiences that we can share and learn from. And then the third point was that people wanted to know about the best language and the best practices to adopt in institutions or in small organizations, small choirs, and critically, how to encourage our colleagues to adopt those best practices also. So bear those in mind. Does that sound like something everybody can get behind? And you can just wave your hands on the screen if you feel like it, if you don't feel too foolish doing so. Yeah, thumbs up. I mean, we've all been teaching via Zoom, right? So there's a lot of, I'm going to be doing this an awful lot, teaching small children. Yes. So bear with me. So we have an hour and a half, a little under an hour and a half. I'm going to break this down into 3 sections. One is foundations. So really talking about the foundations of who trans people are and what we are bringing into a rehearsal room. Because if we don't know where we're coming from, it can be very hard to think about how we work with each other. And with the best will in the world, I have found that in musical spaces, there is often a large degree of ignorance, even from people who are well-meaning and warm-hearted. It can be quite difficult to work together when our expectations are so fundamentally different. So I wanted to talk about the foundations of being a trans person in the UK. I am going to be UK focused for this. If you want information about other countries, I am more than happy to send through resources from my colleagues sort of globally, because I work globally as a trans activist and feminist activist, and just get in touch afterwards. Elizabeth can give you my email address. You can find me on Twitter. Just let me know what you want. I'll try and hook you up. Then, second section is the specifics of being a good colleague and a good teacher. From that, third section is going to talk about the specifics of trans voices, and that will very much be based on my anecdotal experience with my trans colleagues and with my trans students and with myself, and the things that I've found have really helped with my voice and with my teacher. And Mandy, I'm just going to give you a little wave. We share the same singing teacher, and a lot of her practices that she has developed for sort of all voices, I have found to be unbelievably helpful when dealing with trans students in particular. And then we'll have a Q&A. So first off, foundations. And this is sort of not just who we are as trans people, but really thinking critically about where do we get our knowledge of who trans people are. Now, I'm going to have to go a little bit theoretical just for like 5 minutes, if you would humor me. Elizabeth just mentioned that I've just finished my PhD. So that is on the performance and the analysis and the historical reception and knowledge about Barbara Strozzi, who hopefully, if people here are singers, they know about the 17th century composer who wrote some amazing madrigals. So if you're looking for madrigal settings in some fantastic trios and duos, look to Barbara Strozzi. And for looking at someone like that, what was really important was to not just look at what we know about her, but to look at the misinformation which has circulated for such a long time that we believe that those lies are truth. And to do that, I had to use an amazing scholar called Nancy Tuana, who is a feminist scholar. And Tuana, one of her main points was we can't just think about how knowledge spreads. We have to think about how ignorance spreads. Because ignorance isn't just a lack of knowledge. Ignorance is misinformation or disinformation, which gets spread and believed and reproduced. And she called this the production of ignorance. And we can see this, you know, in our current world of sort of social media, scams and conspiracy theories. You know, we can see how misinformation gets reproduced all the time to our detriment as a society. But it's also really critical when we think about trans people to think about how this misinformation is produced. Because with the absolute best will in the world, if what we think we know about trans people is limited to what we have picked up from mainstream media or from a mainstream society, then unfortunately we are not working mostly with truth or with knowledge, we are working with ignorance. And to combat that, to really think, what is it that we know? What do we truly know? We have to start thinking, what is it that I think I already know? Where did that knowledge come from? Were those people who gave me that knowledge, were they themselves knowledgeable? Why might they have told me this? And from that, to really think about your biases, what might be missing, and to think about where else to go. So if nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this webinar, I would love you to have that moment of stopping and thinking, going, do I actually know that? Or is that something which I inferred or picked up from an article in the Times or something I heard on Radio 4? And where did it come from, and why might they be saying that? So moving on from that, I'd love to talk a little bit about what trans is and what it is not. And three sort of fundamental principles, which I think are really important to bear in mind when we think about trans people, is the word trans is deliberately designed to contain multitudes. It is an umbrella term. And we talk about umbrella terms, and something which I find really useful to think about when we say umbrella terms is, why do we need an umbrella? Corny, but true. We talk about an umbrella, you shelter under it. You shelter under it because there is something which you need protecting from, you need to join together. So trans is a very broad term that was deliberately coined in the early 90s to be a place where people who experience discrimination because they are too gender variant, they are too different, can come together to work together. So that huge umbrella can contain words which go in and out of fashion. And trans fashion moves really fast, just so you know. So I could give you some like good terms to use and good terms not to use, but I promise you that in 5 years, they'll be out of date again. But trans and transgender seem to have been doing pretty well since the early 90s. So maybe start from there. But within that, you'll find all kinds of different experiences. You'll find people who are sort of living in different ways, expressing themselves in different ways, using different pronouns, using different terms. They'll present their bodies in different ways. They'll treat their bodies in different ways. Because critically, that word trans, it is a multicultural phenomena. This is a global term. And in every country, every language, you find different ways of expression within that. But critically, again, this umbrella, everyone underneath that umbrella will have experience of being told, no, you are not who you say you are, or who you say you are is too much. You know, why do you have to be like that? Why can't you just be normal? And it's through that that we sort of fight together, we work together to try and support each other to reach a full equality of being. Audre Lorde very famously said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And that can be seen as a foundation for thinking about what the scholar Kimberly Crenshaw talked about as intersectionality, that you can't pull people apart. There's no one way of being anything. And all the different aspects of who we are interact into shaping our experiences of the world. So we can't look at things like trans equality without looking at other questions of equality, of inclusion, of exclusion. It's very relevant at this point to mention the fact that in the UK, certainly, a large number of trans people are also disabled. Now, that can be for many different reasons, but one of the leading theories as to why that is because healthcare is so frequently difficult for trans people that a lot of trans people experience chronic health problems because they're not receiving good enough care from their doctors, or may well be experiencing mental health problems because they are being excluded from their families, they're being treated badly at school, they're being treated badly by employers or by society at large. So we can't really think, oh, how do I do my best by my trans colleagues without also thinking, how do I do my best for my disabled colleagues? How do I do my best for my Black colleagues? How do I make sure that these rehearsal spaces, these musical spaces, are free from racism? How do we make sure that they're free from misogyny? Because trans people experience sexism and misogyny just like any other woman would if they are trans women. And trans people who are trans men, that is to say they were assigned female at birth, but they are men, or trans people who might describe themselves as genderqueer, like I would, or non-binary or agender, most trans people know what it's like to experience misogyny and sexism. And that's another big problem in our musical cultures. So again, always coming back to that idea that we've got to think intersectionally about who trans people are and what our needs are. But then the crucial point I also want to bring up, and I will bring it up briefly, but I could talk about it all day, is that trans history is very long, super long. We talk about trans as if it's a fad. And again, if we're looking at sort of media depictions, this idea that trans people are a new thing. Now, it is absolutely true that there has been a growth in visibility, a real explosion of visibility in the last 5 years or so. There's also been a big growth in backlash. But the modern trans movement, by which I would say people organizing themselves under a banner of gender and sexual minorities, of working for their rights, of saying that they had a right to change their bodies, to change their government data, to live as they were, we can really trace that back to around 1860s, the early 1860s. So this modern movement for recognition, protection under the law, protection from violence in our Western cultures is so long. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not a fad. People, unsurprisingly, want to live freely and free from discrimination and to be known as they are. And I'm currently working on my second book on trans history. So again, shut me up because I could talk all day about this, but we're not new and trans singers are not new. Again, I came out as a teenager. I was already working in semi-professional choirs by that point. I spent the majority of my career being told that I shouldn't be in music, that I shouldn't exist, that, you know, there are no trans musicians. And then I suddenly find out there are loads of trans musicians. You know, hell, a trans woman who was a composer won an Oscar for her compositions in what, the 60s or the 70s? You know, Wendy Carlos is an amazing trans composer and she was a forefront of musical innovation. There are trans musicians everywhere, but unfortunately, we've usually been told that we're the only ones and that maybe we should leave the music industry. And what we have seen in the past few years is we really have reached a critical nexus where we are making connections, we know that we're out there and we're not going back. And I think what's really exciting is that people who aren't trans can be part of that and can support that, because hopefully you would agree with me, I think most of us do, if we are a music education, music is for everyone. It's a universal human language. It is one of the most incredible things that we can share with each other, and we don't want anyone excluded from that. I'm going to run through this very, very quickly, because if I don't, I won't get round to any other points. But trans people do experience there are certain experiences that may well play into what we are bringing to a rehearsal room. So clearly, you know, we are not just when you come to a rehearsal space, when you come to an audition space or a practice room, you are bringing everything that you have experienced before. Now, particularly when we're talking about working with younger singers, I think it's important that we just go through some of the issues that they may be experiencing in their lives so as to realize what we might be helping with, to understand, I think, some of the seriousness of what we might be dealing with, particularly as teachers. There are things I think we need to be prepared for. I'm going to try and run through this a little bit quickly. I'm so sorry. I'm going to try and get through this quickly before we get into the next section, simply because I could spend all day here. It is a bit depressing. I can't make any excuses or apologies for that. It is what it is, but I think it's important to know. So let me just bring up my data. Otherwise, I will get some of these numbers wrong. So just bear with me for 2 seconds. I will say that the information I'm using here, I will be using sort of amalgams of various different data points, and they have come largely from the Stonewall LGBT in Britain Trans Report of 2017, which I'm sending to Elizabeth, and the information that I'm sending, research carried out by the Scottish Trans Alliance and research carried out by the EU. So they presented a report called Being Trans in the EU, which is a comparative analysis of survey data throughout European countries. I think critically, the things I want to think about are at school. And Stonewall has done a great deal of information about what trans people and gender non-conforming young people who maybe don't know if they're trans or not, but who, again, you can think of them under that trans umbrella. They're being bullied for being gender non-conforming, whether or not they say that they are trans. Their bullies have said there is something wrong, or there's something different about you. And I keep saying this word bullies, so there's no way around it, that the majority of trans students are bullied at school. I certainly was bullied at school. When we look at data points, we're looking at over 90% of trans students saying that they are bullied at school. And critically, they are being bullied not just by their peers, but by their teachers. And that is something which I experienced very badly. It absolutely dents your confidence in the adults around you. And it really does dent your ability to engage in the educational process. Because how can you? You know, you're suffering all the time, you're being excluded. Very often students are being physically attacked. Cyberbullying is on the increase, which can make students feel there's no way they can escape this. Another big problem is that home life is often very difficult for trans people. Now, looking at Stonewall's latest report into trans lives, they found that 1/4 of all trans respondents to that survey had experienced homelessness. And that was within a year of that report. When we look at teenage runaways, and I would encourage you to look at the work of places like the Albert Kennedy Trust that helps LGBT young homeless people, parental disapproval, parental abuse is a very large reason. It's a very common reason why young people end up homeless, why they end up having to run away. A lot of trans people have experienced discrimination even trying to find housing. And sadly, the rate of domestic abuse for trans people, whether that is from parents, other family members, from spouses, from housemates, is incredibly high. So looking at the report from Stonewall, you're looking at nearly 1/3 of all trans people in that report said they had experienced domestic abuse within a year of that survey being sent out. People do not have it easy. Trans people throughout the UK don't have an easy time of it. And even people who, quote unquote, may seem fine at rehearsal or in performances or in auditions may well have a weight of discriminatory, exclusionary experience of abuse and pain that they are bringing with them. Now, there's not much we can do about that. You can't fix it in a rehearsal space. You can't fix it in a musical space, but you can provide something different. And I think that is really crucial for me. And I think of my own experiences in a choir as a teenager being bullied very, very badly at school. Luckily, I was not being bullied at home. But I had a really rough time at school, particularly because of some of the teachers. And choir was probably one of the only reasons I kept going to school and didn't drop out entirely. Now, the older kids who were in choir were amazing. They didn't bully me the way that my classmates did. They supported me, they made me laugh. And I knew that every lunchtime I could escape to this magical room with its overheated radiators and a music teacher who really should have, you know, had his teeth cleaned a bit more than he did, and we could sing Bartok, and we could sing Foray, and we could come together and create something really beautiful and really special. So even something as basic as that, is creating a space in which people can feel safe and valued and express themselves, is vital. If you are working specifically as a teacher, I think it's really important to think about the resources available to you, and I will be sending around Gendered Intelligence's information afterwards. Gendered Intelligence is a UK organisation that works with gender non-conforming and trans young people, their families, their teachers, particularly trying to make things safer and trying to provide better options for the future. So really saying to these kids, you know, what do you want to be? What do you want to do? We're here to help you find that. I'm going to probably move on now so that I don't get too stuck. But again, just worth bearing in mind that the majority of trans people have experienced harassment, if not outright assault, in social situations, particularly things like bars, pubs, when you're in theatres, when you're in performance spaces, that kind of after the show bar, or transport. So moving from one place to another. So on a really basic point, it's good to think about, where do we hold rehearsals? Where do we hold performances? Is there a safe way to get back afterwards? Can we travel in a group to get back to a train station? You know, little points, just making sure that everyone is supported, basically. And I would like to move now onto some more concrete points about how to be a good colleague, a good teacher, a good choir leader, to our trans students, to our trans friends. But again, if you want any more information, ask me, I will send it through afterwards. So one of the things I like to talk about and really think about when it comes to being a trans artist and working with trans artists is that while there may be some new information it's good to learn, I'm absolutely encouraging you to take 4 hours out of your life, brew a pot of tea, cut yourself a slice of cake, and sit down and read a book or read some articles or watch a documentary, and I'll send through a list of recommendations. That specific knowledge is incredibly useful. But even more than that, to my mind, is using the knowledge you already have. And the knowledge we already have as musicians is potent. It is really quite remarkable what we can do with that when we come back to the foundations of what we know, what we do, how we approach each other, rather than trying to overcomplicate things. So I like to talk about empathetic communication and how allyship comes out of basic principles of empathy, compassion, and being with each other. So I would say there are 3 principles, and I always love putting them in numbers because then it makes it easy for me to remember as well. And the first thing is to listen rather than assume, and it is just listening. In the same way as collaborative music making begins with listening. I do a lot of operatic work where I improvise. So the last opera I did, actually through lockdown, we did it online, was entirely improvised from audience suggestions, and then myself and sort of several other musicians improvising from that. And you can't create without listening. That sense of being together, of listening to someone's cues, not just what they're saying verbally, but what they're saying with their bodies, what they're saying with their breath. And then we made something incredibly special. And I think if you can do that, listening in a conversational context, it's actually as easy. We can do that. And being free to listen rather than make assumptions. And thinking here specifically about language, because people often ask about language, and I can tell that this is a concern, is that language changes fast. And for example, if you were starting out thinking about trans-inclusive language in the 80s, you might well be saying transsexual. If you were doing it in the 90s, you would often be saying transgender. There was a point in the early, sort of not early, but mid, I would say around 2008 to about 2013, 14, where trans with an asterisk was really popular. And I can't tell you what's going to be popular next. But I can tell you that if you listen first, you'll probably find out. And that's fine. You don't have to know the answer because you can listen and then you'll know. And it's giving people that space to communicate rather than assuming what they already know. And I think of my own personal experiences. The thing I always find very sad is when someone will push themselves in, and it's often coming from a place of insecurity, that they want to demonstrate that they know. And they'll say something like, oh, this is CN. She identifies as they, and she is a non-binary trans. And I'm thinking they're going, well, but I'm just they. And, you know, actually, you know, there's a lot in that sentence that I would never use myself. And it's all become a bit embarrassing. And now I have to contradict you. And now everyone feels flustered. And now we're just going to feel like we're all going to die of embarrassment. And that's not a good start to anything. But if you had just listened to how I talk about myself, or simply asked, CM, what pronouns should I use? And I'd say, use they. And they go, great. And then you could just say, oh, here's CM, they're a musician. You know, their mezzo goes down with the mezzos, and it becomes very easy. You can ask, does someone want you to give a heads up to other people that you're trans, or would they prefer to do that in their own time? Because some people won't want other people to know and some people would. For me, way more helpful if someone can prep others in advance. I've been out for 20 years. Like, I'm sick of coming out. If someone else can say, just heads up, CN's trans, please don't, misgender them. Brilliant. Other people want to do it themselves. Other people won't want you to mention it to a single person. Those are all completely valid. Just ask, just listen. It is, again, we get so embarrassed of doing the wrong thing that I think we push ourselves into the wrong thing. But we can take the time to find the right answer rather than going straight for the wrong one. I think the third point about this empathetic communication is using what we already share. Again, as musicians, we do that all the time. And I'm thinking specifically of choral singing, the ways in which we listen to each other's voices, the ways in which we blend our voices, that we create this sound together. And I'm going to stretch a metaphor here, but I don't care because I can, is I think it works really well when we think about the experiences and foundational emotions that we share here. Because something that I really come up against with people who aren't trans, who want to understand what it's like being trans, is they say, but I can't understand. Oh, I don't want to presume. Oh, it's so difficult. How can I presume? And I feel like saying, well, no, you can't know exactly, in the same way I can't know exactly what it's like to have MS or to have a twin or any of these other experiences, which are so unique and individual. But I can understand what it's like to have a sibling, and I can understand what it's like to have my own disability. And I can, crucially, understand the foundational emotions which you are expressing. So if I think of my experiences as a trans person, both the bad and the good, those experiences can be boiled down to things which I think most people have experienced too. I think nearly everyone knows what it's like to be excluded. I think nearly everyone knows what it's like to be deliberately misunderstood, or to be made fun of, or to be hated for something they're not. Why would you do that to me? And those experiences might be large. They might be something which has happened over and over again. They might be a moment in childhood that you can pinpoint. But I think that gives us a way in to each other. I also think nearly everyone understands what it's like to need to be respected, to need to be genuinely included, not as a, here's our sad sack friend, come along, we're going to pity you, come and have a pint, but to genuinely feel part of a group, to feel valued, to love being with the people around you. And I think people know and desire to be treated as authoritative in their own lives. And by that, I mean that their experiences are true, that who they say they are is real, that they have agency over who they are, that they are believed, that they are trusted. It doesn't help anyone if I say, oh, XYZ happened to me, and someone says, well, let me play devil's advocate, are you sure? Being treated as if I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to me is profoundly alienating, but I think most people know that. We all have that experience, what it's like when you say something true and someone else goes, I'm just not going to believe you for who knows. So I think using those specifics of shared experience, if we focus on the specific things that you may not understand about each other, say, for example, oh, I can never know what it's like to have surgery. I'd never know what it's like to change my body. We can get mired down in that. But if we come back to, I know what it's like to want to shape my own life, then we can start to understand those specifics. And then I think the third point of this empathetic communication is making it very clear that everybody matters and nobody is left behind. And I mean, I'm thinking about this in ensemble singing. I'm sure we all know what it's like to sing in an ensemble where some voices are valued more than others. And it's the star voices which are given the best treatment. And, some voices have to work harder at pushing the other voices along. And I don't like that. I don't like that. It's a profoundly painful experience. I don't like listening to it. I don't like being around that kind of musical culture. I hope we have also had experiences of being in ensembles where it legitimately matters that everyone is singing to the best of their capacity, where you have that real combination of sound. And it is magical. It blows the top of your head off. That's why we sing together as human beings. My favorite form of singing is duet singing. And I have a duet partner that we've been singing with, God, I don't even know how long, 15 years. And my voice is not more important than hers. it's and her voice isn't more important than mine. It's that incredible balance that we find together, and then it's just pure bliss. I mean, honestly, it couldn't be better. And that to me is also how we should treat people in our day-to-day lives. You know, we come alive when everyone is valued as essential rather than being treated as an add-on. And trans people, unfortunately, are often seen as add-ons, particularly when it comes to things like musical spaces, like, oh, we couldn't get round to you, or you know, our audience were kind of, they were fine with this, but this was too far, and now you have to go away because you're too far and too difficult to understand. And I think coming from that basic point of everyone is included, everyone is valued, it makes some choices very easy. And so fears about, well, what if audiences won't get it, which I think on a professional stand, this is something you frequently hear from arts organizations. Well, there are lots of times we know that audiences won't get it, or we fear that they won't, and we say, well, tough luck, we're not leaving people behind, we're not going to change what we're doing to fit a bigoted agenda. But most of the time, honestly, audiences will get it, and they will be with you, and you don't need to leave anybody behind. And you know, I've been running a trans arts night for 10 years. I've been running it at Barbican for 4 years. We've sold out every single time at Barbican. You know, the audiences love it. They're not the problem here. And I think the more you create an inclusive space, the more space there is for the audience to join you, and the more space there is for other musicians to join you. And I think that essential point that there is no universal if some people are excluded, there is no neutral if some people are excluded, really helps me to come back to what am I trying to do as a colleague, as a musician, and as a teacher. So that is, I think, what I would call the foundation of our empathetic communication as teachers and as colleagues, as choir leaders. But then I think there are some other additional steps we can do to make musical spaces more trans inclusive. So first off, I think, is to keep things simple and descriptive. This is partly a language thing, but I think, again, crucially, is coming back to this lack of assumptions. When we think about voices, and I could go off on one about historical vocal labeling because it's so exciting and it's so interesting, but we add a lot of gendered terminology to voices that we don't need to add, and actually historically that we didn't add. And if we just pull it back to basics and describe what's there rather than adding something else, you often find that anything that could be difficult for trans people goes away. So in choirs, it's pretty exclusionary, and also just a bit when choir leaders will say ladies to mean sopranos and altos, because actually you'll often have male altos. Even in a non-trans choir, you have male altos. And I think of my mother, who is not trans, and she has a low contralto voice, and she sings tenor in her choir because they don't have enough tenors. She can get the notes, so why not? So I think if we mean sopranos and altos, let's say sopranos and altos. If we mean tenors, let's say tenors. But saying ladies and gentlemen, when in fact, even with non-trans singers, you're going to have a mix. It's just a bit pointless, really. I don't see the need to do it. You will find trans singers of every single vocal register, and trans singers will be singing every kind of vocal part. So don't worry about excluding them or putting them in a special category. Just go with what the vocal part is, and that's usually fine. Practical is often a really sort of thinking practically is really helpful. And I already talked about making sure that there's a safe route to and from rehearsal and performance spaces. And that's really, you know, again, having a convoy or work to the tube station is really helpful. Just making sure things are well lit can be really helpful, particularly if people have experienced violence in the street before, which I certainly have and a lot of people have. Talking about unisex toilet and changing facilities. Now, this is a point where there's a lot of smoke, and there's a lot of, we talk about sort of heat without light in the debate over gender neutral facilities. And it's funny, if you say gender neutral, it can often bring people's backs up. If you say unisex, it often doesn't. I'm going to come back here again to this point about intersectionality and about trans people being varied, but also all of singers being varied. Having a safe unisex facility which is large enough, which has grab rails, which has a baby changing facility, which has proper soap and a proper alarm cord, this is going to be helpful for all of your singers. you are trying to make a space which is useful for all of the musicians and all of the audience members. And to do that, I would absolutely recommend that you look for places that have good toilet facilities, not just because trans people as a homogenous group need unisex facilities, because they don't. I prefer them, but a lot of trans women will just prefer to use the ladies. A lot of trans men will just prefer to use the gentlemen's. But because you want to make something which is safe for everyone and is easy to use for everybody, and make it clear that everyone is welcome there. Now, if you're in an old building with old facilities, being upfront about that is the way forward, rather than being ashamed about it and defensive. Cool, you know, we only have gender segregated facilities, so what are you going to do about that? Ask people. It's okay to ask, what would you feel most comfortable, and be open to the suggestion of what's going to come there. Now, if I'm working with, what I would usually do is I would designate them all as unisex, except if I have people who need to have single sex facilities, in which case, again, ask and listen. So my answer is going to be different based on the needs of the people there. And that's okay. That's absolutely fine. Something else in terms of practicality is choices around concert wear. And this is something that trans musicians often experience a lot of difficulty with, is that there are all of these gendered assumptions about concert wear. And if they're not communicated clearly, we can often find ourselves in a position where we're sort of told off or disrespected for dressing as ourselves, or we are actively being pushed into misgendering ourselves on stage, or it's just this kind of uncomfortable miasma of like, please don't embarrass us by being all trans in public. But it's, I think, just make it clear, you know, if you say, you know, formal concert wear, this can mean a suit or a dress or whatever, or we prefer neutral colors. You know, just make it really standard, and say, you know, please pick what you feel most comfortable in. Just making it that really basic, really obvious, and not pushing anyone into something they're not comfortable with. I think it's as basic as that. I mean, I was just going to make a little rude comment about bright colors in concert wear, which I don't like because I mostly wear black, and then I have to try and find something in a color. But you know, obviously, but you know, let people make up their own minds. They know how to do that. It's fine. Making your commitment obvious and ordinary is a really valuable thing you can do for trans people, and keeping it consistent even when we're not there. And by that I mean, don't wait for a trans person to come out before you make a trans inclusive space. It might be corny, but you can put something on your choir's website about, we welcome all people here. You know, mention a trans singer that you like. You know, if you've got a Twitter feed, share something from a trans composer. Make it clear that you value trans musicians, as hopefully you are doing for every other kind of musician in the world. It's making that space, which is so obviously open and warm and welcoming, that we know that we're going to be welcome there. Making it ordinary, again, I mean that this isn't a kind of, let's all have a very special trans, you know, those after school specials in like American cartoons and American TV shows. It's not that kind of, let's all have a serious discussion about the trans. It's just basic. It's ordinary. It's, you know, that it's not weird or strange. It's just, cool, I'm here for every singer. Why wouldn't I be? You're just another singer. Sorry, but you're not that special, but in a nice way, if you know what I mean. Because again, when I'm coming into a rehearsal space, I don't want to be singled out and be special. I want to be a working musician, and I want to be valued for what I can bring in terms of my talent, but I also want to be worked hard. And if I make mistakes, I want to be called out on them. And I want to be part of that ensemble. But keeping it consistent, I think, particularly means that even when we're not there, stand up for us, because people will say things when we're not there that they wouldn't say to my face. And it really matters to me that I know I can trust people to not go along with that. And if, for example, you know, thinking about my role as a white person, often in all white musical spaces, that I have heard so much racism from white people in music who do it with a kind of, we all agree with this, right? Surely we all agree with this horrible point that I just made. And even just saying, no, I don't. It's so basic, but it disrupts that sense that it's okay to be bigoted when the people that we're being bigoted against aren't in the room. So I know that colleagues have talked behind my back asking about what genitals I have or how I have sex. And it matters to me that my colleagues who support me just say, I don't want to talk about that. That's rude. And it doesn't have to be that's transphobic. That's rude is pretty good as a way, because people can say, no, it's not transphobic, but it's quite hard when you've been talking about someone's genitals and someone else says that's rude to say, no, actually, it's not rude. Now, we get asked these things to our faces as well. But when I can't be there to stand up for myself, please stand up for me. Again, I would do it for you. And I think there's that sense where allyship becomes friendship, because if someone is talking shit about a friend of mine behind their back, I'm not going to stand for it. And it's that same feeling. Another point, being the specific, is to know what you're going to do when things go wrong before they go wrong. And this one is one that I see a lot of organizations and a lot of people struggle with, because we don't want to do things that go wrong. We don't want there to be problems. And so it can be very easy to fall into thinking, if we don't want there to be problems and everyone working together is coming from a good place and everyone wants to get along, then surely we won't have problems. But even with that, we will, because we're humans and we clash and there's conflict. And if someone has a solution to that, you can find, please send it straight to the UN, don't send it to me. Just, you know, we need to go to the top with that information. So what I would say in terms of conflict or things that will go wrong is to make it very, very easy to give feedback, and to try and make things, you really want to try and solve a problem before it becomes huge. And to do that, you really have to think about feedback systems and change systems on a lower level. So make yourself as the leader very easy to approach. Say, you know, here's my information, you can get in contact. It's not always a very pleasant experience. Again, I'm thinking about my work as a curator and a producer. I have not enjoyed getting emails saying, actually, this was wrong, or actually, this wasn't helpful, or actually, I saw this person, you know, there was something that you put an artist on stage who said this, and then that upset this person, and how are you going to change it in the future? Sometimes it's made me feel really attacked, and sometimes it's just made me feel really depressed. Like, what's the point of doing anything if you can't do it right? And at every point, it has made me better. And at every point, it has made it a better experience for the people that I work with and the audiences that I serve. Now, I do think it's important to be able to tell the difference between sort of bad feedback and good feedback. And sometimes that can be very difficult when you're feeling under attack. So I would always just say, you know, build in a process where you can speak to a friend about it, you know, share it, sit with your own emotions for a while. Again, if someone is yelling at you on Twitter and calling you scum, probably not the best feedback. But if someone's sending you an email saying, actually, I found this really hard, or this badly affected a colleague, even if it hurts, and it has that same instant to go, no, I don't want to have hurt someone. I'm a good person. I don't hurt people. We're all going to do it inadvertently. We can't avoid that. All we can do is keep trying to learn from each other. And then maybe also, I keep talking about cake. I clearly want a slice of cake, but you know, cut yourself a slice of cake, sit down with a big mug of coffee, moan about it in your own mind, work those feelings through, and then get down to it and see what you can do better. And again, crucially, it's taking the time to find the right solution rather than going with the quickest solution. And the story I always use to talk about this is, it's a very basic one. But I was doing, I do a lot of things like literary festivals, and you would be surprised by the people that even when I'm there as a trans author to talk about trans writing, will misgender me on stage or say something really offensive. And so I was doing one of these festivals, and the presenter who had organized the whole thing, who'd read my book, got on stage and misgendered me to the entire audience. Now, the real problem then happened that she went with her quick gut response rather than stepping back and working it through. And her quick gut response was shame. She felt so ashamed. She felt so angry with herself that she turned to me and oh my God, Sian, I can't believe I did that. Oh my God, it's so awful. It's so awful. I'm so sorry. And suddenly I'm meant to be going on stage and speaking to an audience. And I've got to now comfort this person who, because she feels so ashamed, has completely turned inward. And instead of helping me get on stage and deliver what I've been booked to do, she wanted me to comfort her and make her feel better. And I didn't. That's now my policy not to, because I had to get on stage and I said, we'll talk about it later. And I got up on stage and I did my talk. And afterwards, again, it was, so I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And what she was looking for was absolution and me making her feel better. It wasn't very helpful in the moment, and it wasn't very helpful for me. What she had done was profoundly alienating to me. It was very disrespectful. And it did make it hard for me to go and do my job. What I would have loved, and what I have seen other colleagues do, and I think it is entirely possible, is for her to have corrected herself in the moment, which many people do. They, and then afterwards to say, without, please make me feel better, but to say, I'm really sorry about that. I didn't know it would happen and I prepped otherwise, but clearly I've still got some more work to do and I'm going to do it. And then if you want to be extra nice, you can say, can I buy you a pint? And by that point, you can usually, but you can really see the difference between people who are like, a problem. I'm going to solve this. And, oh God, I made a mistake. I don't want to be that person. Now it's all about me. So, and we all have that temptation. Like, please don't make, I've done that. I'm sure we've all done that. But it's working on being that problem solver rather than making an additional problem. And then the final part of our talk, I think before we come on to sort of Q&A, is thinking about these specific questions of trans voices. And I'm going to keep saying it again and again. There is no one trans voice, but frequently we talk as if there is, and that there's only one way of being trans. So I will repeat, there is no one way of being trans. Trans people can and do access hormonal therapies and surgical therapies and alternative body modifications, and they also don't. And some people, like me, will do a mix of different things. And some people will do a mix of different things completely different from me. And some trans singers will sing in the vocal range that they initially had. I sing as a mezzo. Some Lucia Lucas sings as a baritone. Some people won't. Some people will sort of change into a different voice type. Some trans people, I'm thinking Alexandra Bork, who's a wonderful trans soprano I work with, she's always sung as a soprano. And, she's a trans woman, a non-binary trans woman, and she sings soprano. It's a great voice. So we can't really make too many assumptions about what voices are going to be coming into our spaces, or whether or not people will have been through hormonal treatment. So I'm thinking of my students and thinking of colleagues I've worked with, and also thinking about famous trans singers, whether in classical fields or non-classical. I made a little list. So you've got people who will never be on hormone therapy, some who will go on hormone therapy while you're working with them, some who've been on hormone therapy for literally decades, thinking of some of my colleagues, and again, some famous trans singers who've, 40 years. Some trans singers will have been on puberty blockers and then progress to hormone therapy. So they will never have had those interim years of sort of not being on hormone therapy, if that makes sense. So someone assigned male at birth would never have gone through a typical male puberty because they would have been on puberty blockers and then begun estrogen therapy. So again, there's so many different types of voices, so many different types of hormonal configurations and different changes along those roads. And the academic study it's in its infancy. I have found some of the academic work really useful. I have found some of it seems a little bit off balance based on what I've experienced in the sort of the real world, quote unquote. So I'm not going to recommend any academic resources at the moment, because the ones I currently know of, I have not found that helpful. However, if you have found things which are helpful or know of ones that I should read, please share them, because there's so much going on. Keep an eye out, basically, because it's changing all the time. But there are three particular things which I have found useful when working with trans singers, which not hugely to do with hormonal changes actually in the voice, but have seemed to be commonalities, which I found across different experiences of different sort of physical treatments. But these are these are the things I always come back to. And actually, I come back to them in my own vocal practice as well. And if you're working with trans singers, whether adults or students, I would really urge you to lean in hard to these three areas of work. The first one, and the most critical, is talking about bodily tension and stress. And I do personally believe, if we talk about bodily dysphoria, now bodily dysphoria for trans people, it's not experienced by all trans people, but it is experienced by a lot. And I know that I've had my own sort of struggles with it. You can think of this old term of being trapped in the wrong body. Now, I don't particularly like that as a term, but I remember using it as a teenager because it was the only way I could express what it was like to have my brain telling me one thing and then my body not being right. And it was so weird. And so you're like, but I know how my body should be. It's like a mental map. I know how it should be, but it's just not there. And there's a lot of really interesting research into this. Julia Serrano has done a lot of work. I've done quite a bit of work. But the basic thing about bodily dysphoria is that's something that can really be ameliorated through surgery, through hormones, and through different ways of being in the body. Again, things like alternative body modification, or even things like exercise and sort of dressing the way that feels good to you. You know, I need a haircut. That really helps. But bodily tension and the dysphoria around that can really impact on the singing voice. And then it's not just that dysphoria. I find it's stress, and it can well be things like depression and anxiety caused by bad experiences. And so I have found that very much in my own body, and that's something I've experienced in all of my trans students as well. And it's something that I think teachers and choir leaders should be prepared to work with. This tension, I'm thinking of different areas. There is particularly a sense of locking in the throat, that sense of a vice-like grip. So that emotional tension and that really crushing of sort of all of the area around here, particularly sort of throughout the vocal apparatus, that is something which is incredibly common, something that I've had to work with a lot. And then the other elements of bodily tension and stress that I found very noticeable is a hunching of the shoulders. That's so common. If you think you hunch the shoulders, you've got that rounded back coming through there. You've got that shortening here of the chest muscles. You often have the head pulling down and then tension through the jaw, through the mouth, often very, very tense mouth, and all of these things stopping the sound, stopping a connection with the body, stopping proper use of breath, and really, again, locking into this hard larynx, this pushed position, and a lack of freedom. I can see Mandy nodding because this is something that we do an awful lot with my singing teacher and your singing teacher, Alison Wells. And this is something which I have found to be transformative in my own life, but crucially, I found it transformative for all of my trans students. And the things that I work with on myself and with them, there are three main points. Is pitching through the imagination rather than through a forced onset on the throat. So really having that sense that the sound is very, very far away. It can just come naturally. It doesn't need to be physically manipulated. The way I like to think about it is you don't try and dance by lifting up your foot and putting it somewhere. In the same way, you shouldn't be trying to sing by pushing sort of as if the throat or as if the larynx is something that you manually put into different gears. We can do all kinds of amazing things with our voices, but we can't do that if we're crunching down on them. So working on that imagination, it's then doing the real work sort of through the body. And that is relaxation work, it's flexibility work, and it's grounding work. And it takes time. I found particularly as a singer, particularly I sort of started retraining very seriously at the end of my degree, when it became apparent that I'd never be able to play piano to the heights that I had been worked towards, and instead really had to think seriously about, could I sing in a virtuosic way instead? And I came to Alison, and she was brutally honest with me. She said, oh, you've got potential, but you've got a lot of problems, which, you know, I knew. And one of the problems, we were working one day, and I said, oh, it doesn't want to work. And she said, what is it? And I gestured downwards. I was like, it. And she went, that's you. That's your body. That's not an it. It's a you. And working, relaxing my shoulders, actually breathing correctly for the first time, getting my knees soft, getting my hips soft. I was so full of tension and so used to holding myself like ramrod straight and just not letting anything in, that was transformative. And I found that with a lot of my trans students as well. They're sort of going, oh my God, I have a pelvic floor. Who knew? I have hips. They move. What? My knees can move. So that kind of work is tremendously liberatory. And then bringing that sort of relaxation work specifically to this sort of area. So it's the release and the relaxation of the vocal apparatus with a particular focus on jaw release. My jaw was as stiff as anything else. Again, anecdotally, I would think most of my trans students grind their teeth at night. You have a stressful lifestyle, you tend to sort of chew down here. It was working on a lower laryngeal position. So again, rather than high and tight, low and soft. A floated tongue, that was really helpful for thinking about and really helped to release a lot of tension in the mouth, working through tension in the lips, obviously through the neck and the sides of the head and the shoulders. But all of this, just thinking about softness, about release, it really, really makes a difference. And I would encourage that focus there. If a student or a colleague is wearing a binder, just check in with them about the best ways of relaxing their body and breathing deeply and freely. It may be the case that they will be able to do that while binding. It may be the case that they won't, but be led with them, work with them rather than against them on that. And the two other really critical points, I would say, which are, they're not trans-specific, but they are something which all the trans singers I know can really benefit from that work, is confidence building. And I don't mean this in a saccharine or patronizing kind of way, but it's realizing, again, transphobia is really, really widespread. And very often, you know, it won't be done where you can hear it. And it won't be necessarily articulated as such. I think of some of the worst instances of discrimination and prejudice and exclusion I've faced as a singer. And it's not people saying, you, CN, are trans, and I do not like that, so I will not hire you. It is, I don't want that in my company. Or what is this? Or it's, you are too weird, you are too different. And being told to give up. I've been told to give up. Of the trans musicians that I know, most of them have been told that they should quit. And that's something you hear from people in education. It's things that you hear from people in production companies. And it's very hard. I mean, I don't know how you can carry that without it being a weight on you, without it affecting you. Hopefully, again, the younger people are, if they've got good teachers, if the tides are shifting, maybe they haven't heard that before. But I certainly know that even with some consultation lessons, which I've given to people in the 1920 sort of age range who are at university, that even with these phenomenal voices, they had, you know, one or two teachers say there's no space for you in music. So I would just be aware that working on confidence building and working on a sense that yes, you belong, yes, you are allowed, is a really important part of working with trans musicians. Even if they carry themselves with all the confidence in the world, just taking that extra time. And for me, for example, I know that because I've had to deal with that, what it has made me is very hard to be vulnerable in a musical space. So I can go in and be confident, and I can, you know, do all of this, you know, yeah, I'm great, I'm confident, I'm professional. But when it comes to doing the work where I have to be really vulnerable, that's hard. And I'm doing a lot of work on that at the moment, because, you know, that I've realized now that that's holding me back. The need to always be ultra professional is now holding me back. But that's something that you can really think about, particularly with students, is have a space where mistakes are okay, where the mistake won't suddenly be held against you like, oh, we always knew you were no good. That they're allowed just to be human and to be valued and to be encouraged to fulfill their potential, rather than always on trial. And then specifically thinking about questions of pitch and range, because this is something people often have a lot of questions about. And I'm very sorry to say to you that the only rule I can give you is to keep an open mind. Again, there is no one trans range, there's no one trans pitch. it's really vital to ask colleagues what they feel comfortable singing, where they feel comfortable singing, and what kind of support they need, and to be open for the fact you're going to get a variety of answers that may change with time. There are just two particular points which I have found through my work, which I think are worth bearing in mind, is that because of this tendency I think most singers have, particularly untrained singers, to push on the voice and to sort of like, I'm singing, you know, yeah, well, kind of, I'm singing now and I'm making a singing sound. I have found that singers who go on testosterone therapy can experience a period where they lose their voices because they don't know where to push the voice anymore, that they've become so used to pushing on the voice, and now suddenly the voice is doing something slightly different and you push on it and it cracks. And there's that, oh my God, I've lost my voice. Now, my experience with those students is that when we come back to releasing the voice and pitching through the imagination, then suddenly there is a voice. And there's all these kind of interesting notes that come out. And that even if there's a period of great instability, it's no different from anything that I've experienced with my cis male teenage students, that you just have to learn that you've got some different notes now and you can't force them out. You've just got to open up. And again, it's moving from that here to that here movement. But I think some patience there is pretty good. You often find there's a sort of that tension, that there can be a burr on the sound. I don't know how best to express it, but there's almost like it's almost like a thrumming of being held that you can sometimes experience with voices new to testosterone therapy. And again, I've just found that relaxation exercises, coming back to things like vocal fry, to focusing on jaw release, tongue release, just really helps get that voice into a freer space. I then find there's the received wisdom is that if you've gone through a typical male puberty, if you've had testosterone, sort of majority testosterone puberty, that once the voice drops, there's no change that can be made to that. I am not so sure, but I don't have the evidence to back that up. All I can say is that in my personal experience, the students I have had who have been on estrogen and progesterone therapies for a longer time are more comfortable in higher ranges and access them in an easier way. Now, that could be hormonal, it could be not, it could just be practice. But what I've also noticed is I have yet to find a student of mine who has the capacity, you know, who has had a voice which is broken. I have yet to find one who isn't also comfortable singing in alto and soprano registers if the voice is freed up and they're allowed to access all parts of their range. Now, of those students, some of them will be singing soprano and alto all the time, and that's where they feel happy. I'm again thinking of my colleague Alexandra. You know, she's got so many more high notes than me, and you know, her voice is just it's just higher than Maya's, and it's glorious. And you know, she sings Rusalka and it makes you cry, and that's great. You know, other colleagues are happy to sing baritone. And then someone like Lucia Lucas, who is, you know, probably the most famous trans singer in the world, singing baritone professionally, and I think she's also now singing alto. You've got a lot of ranges and pitches to work with. And I think the critical thing is to not force anything, not to push anything, but again, coming back to that freedom, that release, and being experimental, playing around with it, being guided by what your student wants to do. And being very aware, something which I have found is that some of the vocal therapies of speech that trans people are offered might focus on pushing the voice into a certain range. One student I'm working with at the moment talks about being told to think about, they were told to think about a ledge, and that you pushed your voice into a higher ledge, and this idea of sort of forcing it upwards or forcing it downwards. And that's something that can be a little bit hard to work with, and something that I've had to, I think it's being sensitive to the fact that you want people to maintain pitch ranges that they're comfortable with and which feel congruent with who they are, but that you can reach that, again, not by pushing and forcing, but instead by almost floating. So instead of sitting on a ledge, it's like we float through the ceiling, which I think, you know, it's just a different way of accessing those head registers or chest registers. Again, even if you're going down, you don't push down and in, you kind of float your way down, and suddenly you've got all these wonderful low notes which you have access to. But I think that's something There are several books out about training trans voices. I'm afraid to say that I have not. There's one book actually in particular about training trans singing voices. I'm afraid to say I haven't read it yet, simply because it is very, very expensive and my academic institutions haven't bought it yet and I can't afford to buy it myself. So it may well be full of amazing information, or it may well be something that I would disagree with. So I'm afraid I can't guide you there as to whether I think it's worth it or not. But if you can afford to check it out, definitely do. But I'm just looking down to my copy. The book I find most helpful is Janice Chapman's Singing and Teaching Singing, which is also the recommendation I was given from my singing teacher. And I have found, you know, trans people are not, again, we're not special. Sorry to say that, but, you know, we're not special snowflakes. We are just people. And the same things that work with other voices work with trans voices. So I would start from that basis rather than trying to get too worked up in knots, and just approach it as a healthy voice and a healthy body, and that holistic voice, that the voice is not just here, it's the whole body working together. And then I think the final thing I would recommend before we move on to Q&As is, with this idea of working with trans voices, I'd say go listen to some trans voices and go listen to what those singers have to say. And I will send this round again to Elizabeth in the resource pack. But sort of 4 singers that I would recommend. I've already recommended Lucia Lucas, so go check her out. Ella Taylor is an incredible young soprano working in the UK, so go check them out. Harrison Knights is a fantastic choral singer, and he also works as an actor, so Harrison Knights. And then Holden Madogamy, who is a tremendous operatic tenor currently based in Germany. And so all of them have different ways of using their voice, all of them have different hormonal configurations, all of them are flourishing, and they've all got some great things to say about being a trans singer and working as a trans singer, as well as making beautiful music. So I think I would really recommend you go check them out. And we have now just over 15 minutes for our Q&A session. And so if that's all right with you, I'm going to say, Elizabeth, do you want to switch it over so that we can sort of have a bit more of a chat? And if you have things that you want to ask, but you'd be more comfortable writing rather than speaking, please put them into the chat itself. And thank you just so much for listening. It really means a lot to me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cian. That was incredible. I've actually had a few questions that have been sent directly to me. So do you mind if I ask you some of those first? And then I guess that might give people some opportunity to write in the chat if you have questions as we go through.
Fabulous. Also, I'm just going to grab...
Oh, fab. So let me just go back. So I've had a question saying, how do we cisgendered folks be the best allies without running the risk of being accused of virtue signalling? For example, I want to use the title MX instead of Ms., Miss or Mrs. This is as much for feminism reasons as trans ally reasons. Would it be offensive for me to use this? And does it come across as some kind of form of appropriation, or is it completely appropriate?
Well, I mean, okay, bear in mind that obviously I am not the grand high master of all trans people, although in my worst moments, you're like, maybe that would be, no, sorry, I think we all have our Napoleonic moments, but, you know, I can give you my answer, and I can give you an answer that I know from a lot of my friends and colleagues, which is that I think it's great. I absolutely, from a feminist reason, I think actually it's really rubbish having gendered titles. You know, and I would love to see more people using MX, just to demystify that, in the same way that I love to use they as a pronoun, but I don't think that means just genderqueer people or just non-binary people. There are so many reasons why you'd want to have a non-gendered pronoun, and so many people who'd want to use that. So I would say go for it, bearing in mind that some people will disagree with you. And that can be difficult because there isn't a standard way of doing things. I'm afraid to say that there is a huge amount of trans community infighting, or communities infighting. You know, we're always discussing things. We're always, sadly, sometimes falling out over things. And there isn't a one right way of doing it. But I know that the position I am saying here is one that a lot of people agree with also. And I personally think it's worth taking that risk. And I am encouraged when people take that risk. In terms of sort of being the best ally without speaking over people, or without sort of sadly, the people who would accuse you of virtue signaling are probably going to do that whatever you do, because that's kind of the point of terms like virtue signaling or snowflake or, oh, you're also woke. I mean, it's political correctness gone mad with updated terminology. But I think the way that I find most helpful is if you can refer people back to trans sort of writers or speakers, that's really helpful. But also remember, there's nothing appropriative about standing up for human equality. You know, that is a really foundational point. And there's a really nice way of framing it, is that you don't have to persuade other people not to be discriminatory. They should be persuaded. Why should you discriminate amongst people? Really, that's their argument to make, if that makes sense. You know, to move away from a position of equality and respect and compassion. Why? You know, it's, and I have found that quite helpful, actually, as a way of framing it. Is, you know, you've got to have a really good argument to convince me that I should discriminate against people, that I should hate people, I should distrust people. Because frankly, I think it's easier and more pleasurable to just come from a point where, you know, humans, we're all equal. We're a bit different. We're also the same. You know, it's not profound stuff, really. So I think demystifying it, that's my other point. You know, it's normal, it's boring, you know, not an argument. And the best way of winning an argument is after. That's something I always come back to. You might well not convince someone in the moment. If people are set up to argue, they want to have a fight, they're not going to agree, ever. They might well change their minds a year down the road. And if you can give them something to ponder in that moment, whether that's resources, whether that's a perspective shift, then that's something that might make a difference. And that's certainly something that I've noticed with my work, is that you get people, they'll say, oh, you know, I never used to believe this. And then 5 years down the road, it's changed.
Fantastic. I've had a few more questions in. They've all just come in a rush. So I've just had a question saying, can you ask about FTM hormonal treatment and how best to deal with voice change, please?
Oh, okay. I mean, I hoped I'd dealt with that a little bit in my in my talk, but to expand a little bit on it, if you are assigned female at birth and you want to go on hormone treatment, then that hormone treatment is testosterone therapy, and that can be administered in various different ways. That can be through so patches, or through creams, or through injections. There's a lot of questions, I think it's polite to say, about sort of how voices change. There's a lot of inter-community discussion about whether going slow and starting on a low dose makes vocal transitions easier, but it's clearly also a point to do with sort of individual physiognomy and individual hormone levels, because some people start off on a small dose and their voices drop really quickly, and some people start off on a high dose and their voices take years to change. So I think this is my point about coming back to listening to your student or your colleague as an individual, or yourself as an individual. It is a little bit entering the unknown. I think the best thing you can do is to keep working through it in a really gentle way. But I'm going to suggest following Holden Modogamy's work. For a specific example of that, for someone who trained as a mezzo, who then began testosterone therapy and now sings as a professional tenor, and his sort of descriptions of what it was like with his voice changing, because again, there is no one hormonal pathway or hormonal response or vocal change, but there are parameters. So you are likely to experience a voice getting deeper. That could be drastic, that could not be. You'll usually go through a point of maybe not having so much access to the high notes, but then coming back to being able to access the high notes. You know, bear in mind the number of cis men who sing as sopranos and altos. This is not, there is not an on-off switch. There is not a begin testosterone therapy and now you are a baritone and that's the end of the story. There's a lot of learning to do, and voices take a long time to settle, but all voices take a long time to settle. Voices continue to change throughout everybody's life. So unfortunately, you're always going to be learning, but so are the rest of us. So at least it's fair that way. And I see there's one in, I see there's one in the chat. Elizabeth, shall I read this out?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
young men people with, let's see. Was my naturally low pitched singer, help with the tenors. He's coming to the school, he's putting on a sound that's more of a caricature of male singer. I've tried to explain that even male singers can have beautiful high pitched voices, but I can't seem to stop this need to demonstrate singing the male way. How would you encourage a better sound production if I was your pupil? One thing that I would bear in mind is that there's a lot of misinformation on YouTube, and particularly lots of young trans teenagers talking to each other about best ways of passing. And some of the information is so bad. So one of the ones that was around, I think 10 years ago, was like, it was something like if you pitched your voice forward and then you could try and sound like really masculine all the time, but actually you were just sounding like you were playing like a bad teenage boy in a school production. But there is this information that does the rounds. And beyond that, there is such a deep need to be congruent in yourself and to not be misgendered all the time. I think patience would be the first thing that I would think about, that I would want patience for myself, patience for this student. I would want to know a bit more about why. So always coming back, why are they putting this sound on? What is it giving them that they're making this sound? Because clearly it's giving them something. They wouldn't be doing this if they didn't have a need to do this, and they wouldn't be doing this if they didn't feel they were gaining something from doing this. So I think understanding that will be a crucial first step to learning how to provide a healthier and better way of sounding. I would then be very tempted to start looking up trans men who are singing, particularly in higher registers. I'm thinking there is an amazing trans mezzo called Adrian Angelico, and he sings as a mezzo. Actually, sometimes quite a high mezzo. He's also gorgeous. Like, he's got the proper like libertine look, velvet jacket, opera hero look. And he plays Octavian. I traveled to Oslo to go and see him in the opera because I was desperate to see him because he's so good. And he embraces having a high voice as a masculine production. Holden or Harrison has taken testosterone and gone with a tenor sound. I've had some students with a beautiful baritone. Like, there are so many different ways of being a trans male singer that I absolutely think that there is the right, that Catherine's talking about, sort of explaining that male singers can have high-pitched voices. I absolutely think that's one of the ways to go. But I think asking him why he's doing this and being, I'm not trying to sound, I sound so dismissive here. I'm not meant to sound, but those teenage years are such a large part of trying to work out who you are and how you're comfortable in being. And sometimes that can verge into caricature. I was definitely one of those teenagers with like eyeliner everywhere and, the biggest Doc Martens that money could buy, because who was I trying to be? I kind of wanted to be Lou Reed. I also kind of wanted to be Patti Smith. I mainly wanted to look scary in a big black jacket and stomp around and let everyone know that the world was a bad place. And I was very cynical and I was reading French philosophy. We veer into caricature as teenagers because we're learning how to be ourselves. So I think working with that rather than against it is probably going to be the best way through. And also, just check what they're learning online, because there are some really bad vocal practices being shared. And if you know what they're copying, then you might have a better way of working with it to counteract it rather than just pushing against it.
I was also going to say, I've just been sent another question directly to me, so do you mind if I just jump in at this point? Yeah, fantastic. So someone sent me a question saying they've taken over a choir which has always marketed itself as an all-girls choir. Is there a way to make this sort of choir truly inclusive?
I mean, if it's a high voice choir, I just rebrand it as a high voice choir. I mean, sorry if that sounds really simplistic, but if the goal is to create a space where all high voices can come together to sing, then I would make sure that I open my recruitment policies so that all people of all genders who sing high can come and join. And then I would just rebrand it as that. If it's an SSAA choir, it's an SSAA choir, and I would love singing in a choir like that. I love SSAA sounds. I think they're gorgeous. And so long as it was, so long as they made it clear that people like me were welcome to join, I would feel great. And, I know I certainly know from thinking about sort of choir families, you know, there are people who'll have male partners, cis male partners who would love to join, as well as trans male partners. There'll be trans women who would love to join. If there is, you know, if we welcome all people rather than it sort of the idea that, oh, you know, you have to be assigned female at birth to be welcome here. There are lots of trans women who would love to join that. So I think just focus on the sound you want and the sound that you're bringing rather than the identities of the people involved. And that's a really good way around it.
Fantastic, thank you. I've also had another question come through to me. So it says, I started testosterone 2 weeks ago and my voice will change during the next few months. I have to sing, and then in brackets, I'm a conductor and we're having online rehearsals now because of COVID. So I sing through the whole rehearsal. How can I make this so I don't damage my voice?
I mean, singing through a whole rehearsal is obviously can be stressful in general. I again, from my experience, it's not that I have found that there's anything intrinsically harmful about singing while voices are changing. I think it's just about good vocal health and good vocal practice in general. So again, not pushing. If you can demonstrate on an instrument where you need to, you know, get a keyboard with you, that can be a really good fix. But I think it's coming back to basic principles of good vocal health rather than doing anything specific. Again, bear in mind that that is not something which I myself have experienced, but it's something I've experienced with my students, and I have not noticed that they are unable to sing while their voices are changing. Bear in mind that those vocal changes can take a long time, so you are going to be singing through it, but you can sing through it in a healthy way. Don't overstress it, don't over push it, keep hydrated, don't smoke, don't drink too much, you know, all the things that we do to stay healthy. I mean, absolutely keep sort of well hydrated, warm up beforehand, and I would play, you know, absolutely, you know, keep playing as well. I'm trying to think of anything else, but I haven't. There's no magic trick that I've ever heard anyone mention. It's just keeping that good vocal health and being aware when you're being overtired, and making sure that you've got a way of sort of demonstrating otherwise. I think would be important as well. Anything else?
I have had another direct question about how do trans singers find good singing teachers?
Oh, yeah, that one's a hard one. I think you often ask a good singing teacher and then you see if they have recommendations. So I can absolutely recommend Alison Wells, who's my teacher. I can also recommend, oh, I've completely forgotten her name, which is very helpful of me. 2 seconds. Aha. So Holden's teacher is Dr. Stephanie Weiss, and she's currently in Berlin, but she's also Arizona State University, and she does a lot of teaching, and I think she's got some really good networks as well. I'm literally just going to drop. She's running some online masterclasses for trans singers. I'm just going to put this in the chat, which you may find helpful from if you're yourself a singer, but also if you're a singing teacher, her advice and recommendations, and I'm sure she would be able to sort of talk about colleagues of hers that she would recommend. Maybe get in touch with Ella, you know, if you're looking in the UK, and see, you know, sort of who they would recommend. There are several there's a trans choir in London. Yes, so there's London Trans Choir. So I'm just dropping this on here. That is a really good resource. So again, that's back in the chat. So the leader of that choir is absolutely worth asking, because I know that, 2 seconds, let me just grab the name, Stephen Davidson, that he's a trans singer and a trans singing teacher and runs a trans choir. So a lot of good information there. Pink Singers, in my experience, haven't, well, they have got trans members and they've been quite useful. I think another one would be the Fourth Choir. If anyone's heard of that, let me just get that up and share that. I'm putting that down. but asking them not just for resources they have, but who their links are, I think is really important. Hopefully that will be helpful.
That's brilliant, thank you. I'm just going to skip back a tiny bit further in the chat, because Jeremy had asked, are there any trans choir leaders / conductors, and what can we do to encourage more trans people to be musical leaders?
Well, I just linked down to the London Trans Choir. So there's an example of a trans choir and also a trans choir leader. So I think, like a lot of things, when you start looking at what's there, there's more information when you dig beneath the surface. And I'm thinking of sort of trans voices in particular. A colleague of mine, Naomi Oral, who is just about to begin, I think, her PhD looking at trans humanity. There's a lot of stuff going on under the surface, which I suspect is going to come more into the public domain. Give it 3 to 5 years. So I'd say keep an eye out on Naomi Oral's work. I'm going to send around in the resources list. Alexander Pullinger wrote a really good article about trans singers and trans experiences, and that has some more information. But I think I would start by saying, if you want to find the specific people, is conduct the people who are already doing the work, and then someone has just sent me a really good recommendation for a music therapist. So hopefully, would you like me to share that with everybody? Person who's sent me a private message, if you could just send me a private message again to say if it's okay for me to share. Great. Okay. So let me just, sorry, now I've just got to, can I send a message to everyone? Everyone, yes. Okay, so here is a recommendation for a singing teacher. In terms of encouraging people to be choir leaders and musical leaders in general, I think often it's less about encouraging individual people than it is about making the structural changes that will enable that to happen. So I'm thinking of my own perspective. I don't think I've ever really needed much encouragement to compose or produce or direct or anything like that, but I have needed help when I've come across real barriers of discrimination. So there are practical things we can do which will mean that more trans musicians have opportunities for it. One of the things we can do is that when we're looking, for example, a conductor or a soloist, is that we judge them on their talent, not on their previous experience. So we're aware of the fact that their previous experiences might be more unusual than the standard experience. Their CV may be more patchy because they've experienced exclusion, but they may well have the talent that we want. So I always think, it's looking at audio tapes first. It's looking at what someone can do rather than who they are or what they've previously done. And it's finding ways of nurturing that talent. So really investing in it, really building it up, and providing alternative ways of developing a career if someone has not been allowed to go on traditional pipeline. So I'm very big on the idea that we create spaces where people can find work and find opportunities, and encourage that with more of our colleagues. Is this competition genuinely open to everybody? Is this training opportunity actually going to be supportive of all types of people? And again, this is not just a trans issue. We have a lot of systemic problems in music around whiteness, around what kind of bodies we think are acceptable. Disabled people, are disabled people actually welcome? Are they actually supported? But there's a lot going on here. So that's the kind of support that I would want, I think, is sort of making things structurally and institutionally accessible. I hope that answers that question.
Brilliant, thank you. I should just add that as well as sending out the webinar recording, I will obviously take all the links from the chat. Nothing that anyone has sent me as a private message will obviously go out, but the chat will be shared. And CN will be sending me a written resource that will go out alongside the webinar. So lots of this will be written down for you. So don't worry about trying to copy down links from the chat and things. But unless anyone else has any questions, I'm just aware that we've gone slightly over over time. I just want to extend a huge thanks to CN today for an incredible presentation, so much to think about practically. And yes, I can see lots of people clapping in traditional Zoom style, so thank you so much. It's been a fantastic talk. And really brilliant to have, and hopefully the start of lots of discussions and changes for people to be making within their own choirs and settings, or for people to acknowledge the changes that they have already made, and that, you know, to know that they're doing the right thing. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, again, if there's anything else you want, I've just noticed there's one more question that's come up in the chat that's been sent to me directly. So, Elizabeth, will you be able to see that?
I know if it's been sent to you directly. I'm afraid I can't see that one.
What I'm going to do to the person that sent that to me directly, I'm just going to forward it directly to Elizabeth so that she can make a note of that, and we can have a think about that, whether there are any useful resources that we can send through afterwards. It's not something that I have an immediate answer for, but I bet if we put our heads together, we'll have a good idea. So we'll make sure that's included too. But basically, thank you all so much for coming, and you know, thank you. There are people I already know who came. Just thank you, and just have a wonderful Saturday. Even though we're still in lockdown, we can still make music. So I'm make some music and feel good about that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone.